My name is Aurora Rey, and it is my absolute pleasure this afternoon to be moderating the panel Kids These Days, a panel featuring some of Boldstrip's books' preeminent YA authors. I'm thrilled to be here with such a great and eclectic group of folks. I'm going to start out with just some basic bios for introduction, since we have a couple of relative newbies in the room. In no particular order, actually in the order I got them in my email. First off, we have Nathan Burgoine. He is a tall queer guy who writes mostly shorter queer fictions, including novellas and novelettes. Even though shorter fictions are his favorite, Nathan does write novels. His first, Light, was a finalist for a Lambda Literary Award, and his debut YA novel, Exit Plans for Teenage Freaks, personal favorite, was a finalist for the Pre-Aurora Award. More short fiction, novellas, and novels are always underway and almost always include queer speculative fiction or queer romance, or both. Welcome, Nathan. One of our two illustrious Laurens today, we have Lauren Melissa Ellzey, known as Auntie Nell on Instagram, a Black multiracial queer autistic activist and social media influencer. Her writing on disability inclusion has been featured in Neuroclastic, Ellzey, Think Inclusive, and Cripple Media. She completed her BA at Scripps College, where she won the Crombie Allen Award for Creative Writing, and her MS in Library Science at Syracuse University. Lauren Melissa lives and works in New York City. Boy at the Window is her first novel. The second of our lovely Laurens today, Lauren Emily Whalen's latest BSB novel, Take Her Down, is a contemporary femme-driven YA reimagining of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Since its release on March 15th, the Ides of March, of course, the book has been featured on Book Riot and twice on BuzzFeed. Lauren's other BSB title, the young adult novel Two Winters, is available wherever books are sold. She lives in Chicago with her cat, Rosaline, named after the sassy Shakespearean lady. Jeffrey Ricker is the author of Detours, the YA fantasy The Unwanted, and co-author with Nathan Burgoine and J. Marshall Freeman of Three Left Turns to Nowhere. A 2014 Lambda Literary Fellow, he has an MFA in creative writing from the University of British Columbia and teaches creative writing at Webster University. And last but certainly not least, we have J. Marshall Freeman, who is the author of the young adult fantasy novel, The Dubious Gift of Dragon Blood in 2020, and one of three authors of the YA novella collection, Three Left Turns to Nowhere, 2022. His YA adventure novel, Barnabas Bopwright Saves the City, is coming this May from Bold Strokes Books. A two-time winner of the Saints and Sinners fiction contest, Freeman lives in Toronto with his husband. What a fantastic and delightful group. It is absolutely my pleasure to be with y'all. I'm gonna start out kind of pretty simply, but I do wanna put a shout out for both the chat roll where you can talk to the authors and talk amongst yourselves. Always a lively conversation there. If you have a specific question you would like to pose to the panel as a whole or to an author in particular, please use the Q&A box. That's to be sure I see it. And if you have not been attending all weekend, please be sure to check out the sale on select backlist titles from all of the authors featured in this weekend's Bookathon. All right, let's get started. So, why do you write YA? Nathan, I'm going to start with you since you're in my top left corner.
So I jokingly say that I write YA to time travel, but I'm only slightly joking. I think like a lot of queer adults, especially in my generation and older, we didn't find a lot of queer YA novels when we were younger. And especially that struck me when I started working at the bookstore was how many of them actually existed, but were kept out of my hands. So, you know, like you've got John Donovan in '69, Nancy Garden in '82. Rosa Gay wrote Ruby with a Black lesbian character in like 1976. I had just been born, you know, but no one ever let me have those books. So I think the reason I love to write YA is to just increase the chance of some queerling somewhere bumping into a book at the right time. Like it could have been life-changing, but I mean, that's never too late to try to life change, right?
I love that. It makes my heart all flutter. Lauren Melissa, what about you?
I write YA for a multiplicity of reasons, but one of them is because I often think that Teens are underestimated. And in my time that I've worked with teens, I used to be a teen librarian. I've seen that teens are ready to take on and are already taking on so much. And I also see that a lot of teens of color need more representation in novels, to see queer individuals reflected back to them that look like them or look like those that they know. And so that's one of the reasons why, maybe that's two of the reasons why I write YA. I'll probably stop there because then the list will keep going.
Those are really good, really important ones. Lauren, Emily.
So I was a queerling that stumbled upon the right book at the right time. It was Francesca Leah Block's Baby Bebop that thank you, that I stumbled on in the mid-90s. I grew up in a very conservative small town that has recently started an LGBTQ+ group for middle and high schoolers, which warmed my heart. I know that was my reaction. I comment on all of their posts like, you're doing God's work, like, thank you. And that's part of the reason I keep coming back to YA. I write a lot of different things. I was actually first published in erotica, and I continue to write that. But for my last two books, both Take Her Down and Two Winters, they are Shakespeare reimaginings. And Shakespeare is a lot. It's very dramatic. People go to the extremes, but people are also very intelligent and emotional and loving and smart. And for me, that's all teenagers. So it's a beautiful fit.
Fantastic, thank you. It's funny, I think about reading Shakespeare in high school and like the idea of getting a queer retelling kind of would have been magical had that existed. Jeffrey, what about you?
I think everybody has said it much more eloquently than I will. I think I write it. One particular reason is because I read it and I enjoy reading it, and to Nathan's point, you know, I was not able to find the stories when I was a teenager, and you know, the first book I read was the first queer book I read was definitely for grown-ups, and I was probably too young to read it, but so I just I want to put more of those stories out there, and I love that I try and sort of plug into that time in my own life and remember how big and momentous everything was, because it was the time in my life when everything was a first, and I like to writing that is exciting.
I love that. I love that we're sort of getting at the heart of what that experience of being a young adult is all about. And last but not least, Jay Marshall, what are your what drives you to write YA?
Well, while everyone is talking about books that were important to them when they were queer youth, I'm just going to throw out one that really hit me was John Fox's The Boys on the Rock, which I read just at the right time, and the only book he finished before he died of AIDS. And that was the first. I had also read all the queer passages and books on my parents' shelves from James Baldwin and stuff, but that was the first time there was a 16-year-old protagonist, and I was like, oh, okay. And that meant so much to me. I like writing YA because I love large canvases. I like bold ideas, and I like characters who have strong emotions and are going through strong turning points. So that makes YA perfect. I love to read it and I like to write that. And I think also I have a real sense of disconnection for myself at that time. I was so deeply closeted and I think traumatized by just being frozen. If I make a move, someone's going to know about me. And I think I cut myself off quite a bit from my emotions. So it's almost a time I see through a fog. And so I think it's important for me personally as a writer to be going through those emotions on the page.
I love that. It's a therapeutic almost do-over.
Yeah, do-over, yeah.
For that time. I love that. I think about my own experience, and I was not exposed to anything queer as a young person, and yet my grandmother gave me my first like straight romance novel when I was a freshman in high school, and just told me to skip the dirty bits, right? It was such a warped, kind of conservative viewpoint, and my world would have probably been very different had my exposure been different.
Well, we were all the products of grooming by heterosexuals.
So I think several of y'all touched on this because you were sort of alluding to, I think the sort of unique experience of being a teenager and sort of navigating, figuring out who you are in life. And I think that really kind of feeds into, I think, some special considerations that go into writing YA, because I think so often at that age, people kind of feel grown up and feel maybe not like you've got it all figured out, but like you want people to treat you kind of like an adult, and yet you're in a really different place developmentally. So as someone writing for a YA audience specifically, what are some of the considerations that you personally like really take into account in your writing? Laura, Melissa, I'm going to start with you this time.
I definitely take a lot of things into account. One of them that I take into account is staying relevant and contemporary and keeping in mind what is important to teens today, but at the same time, not going too far into that direction, because teens, like all people reading fiction, I believe, read to escape in a lot of ways from what's going on around them. And so I don't want my entire story to be full of text messaging and social media and all of that, when a lot of teens are picking up a book to step away from that. So that's something that I consider. I also like to consider, diversity, and not just from my own perspective, but just in general, like the multiracial identity is very important. It's not often seen. And I grew up as a teen looking for books about multiracial teens, and that was really hard to find. I think I found 2. So that's just a big thing that I'm very passionate about, creating more books for teens, I would say. And then the last thing I like to consider is not telling teens what to do in the story. I think sometimes by the end, I'm like, I want to be like, and so this is the way you should live your life, go for it, but I'm like, wait, they are teens, they're making their own decisions. This is context. I'm giving them context. I'm giving them experience. I'm giving them fun through this story, but I'm not telling them what to do.
That's such a great kind of perspective, because I don't think I would have thought about that, not to be heavy-handed, but like that you sort of like want to imbue like knowledge or wisdom or lessons, and like you can do that to a certain extent, but it's not about giving them that like strict idea or guidance. That's fantastic. J. Marshall, special considerations. What are the things that you take into account with this audience in mind?
Yeah, when I first started writing YA, I was a little dubious about it as a real category. I was thinking, it's a book. It's a book that happens to have a main character as a young person. But as I started writing it, I did think more about things that I wanted to say as a queer elder to queer youth, especially about being brave, about taking chances, about considering, about loving yourself, and not getting yourself knocked down by the world. So I never want to make that a heavy-handed or make it a messagey thing. But I realized that as I was writing that I was coding that in. I was saying that that's important, and you are important as a queer youth. So other than that, it's writing a big adventure-y novel, and putting in real relationships and taking people seriously. But occasionally the author does have some things he wants to pass on.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, about a balance in those, that sort of validation, I think, is something so many of us were missing in stories. And theoretically, like a message that even non-queer identifying youth could take. I mean, I think I look back at some of the people who I thought at that age were like the most confident, the most sorted out, and like they were all, everybody was sort of a hot mess, and trying to figure it out. So it's pretty universal. Lauren, Emily, your thoughts.
Well, it's funny that you said, the people you thought were the most together were also a hot mess. my book, Take Her Down, is pretty much about that. It is about a group of teens at a magnet high school in the months between the election of a controversial US president, you know, when most of them can't vote. And it's that time period between that and Me Too going viral, though neither of those are mentioned explicitly in the book. And in between that, there is a school election where Jude and Bronwyn, two ex-best friends, are going head to head. And I wanted to acknowledge just the messiness of not just teenagers, but just humanity in general. And, you know, we've all been living through a very hectic time period. And for Take Her Down, especially, which I started writing in April 2020, I really thought about, okay, I'm living through all this, you know, I'm an adult. How would I have felt about this as a teenager? Someone who probably feels like they have even less control than most of us do. And some of whom are figuring a lot of things out, including like their sexual identity, like who they are in relation to the world, while they're also trying to, you know, keep their grades up and win the school election that they think is going to solve everything. So that's my main mindset with YA in general. I've written 3 YA novels now, is just to kind of think of things I've been through, but kind of like, okay, how would this have been if I were 20 years younger? My other thing with YA, it's a little more shallow, but I've seen a lot of people over the years just really miscategorize YA as none of the characters curse or have sex. When somebody said that to me, I went through the manuscript of 2 Winters, which I was doing edits on at the time, and the word fuck was used 25 times. And I was just like, yeah, and not everybody uses curse words. That's, you know, up to the author and what's true to the characters. But, you know, my characters are figuring a lot of things out, and sometimes they say bad words and sometimes they have sex. So yeah.
I love that. It's all the microcosm, right, of that kind of that humanity that you were talking about. Jeffrey, I haven't come to you yet on this one, have I?
No, you haven't. That's okay.
I just want to make sure I try to mix up the order, but then I lose track sometimes. So sorry.
Well, no, everybody else has said everything much better than I possibly could. So it's interesting because when I started writing it, I don't think that I consciously thought about, you know, I wasn't keeping it, there wasn't anything I was, you know, keeping in mind. I was just like, I want to write a fun story. And it's sort of like the more I went on with it, I just kept thinking, it's like, I want to do justice to it, really, you know, and to do justice to the audience, whatever audience that may be, and just to tell it as well as I possibly could, without talking down to anybody or trying to, you know, come off as like, you know, trying to be hip with the lingo, because that's not going to be me, ever, never, not going to be me. So I think that that's just like a respect for the material and a respect for the audience. That's, you know, and I think that's really what I wanted when I was that age, you know, that and to, you know, get through high school alive.
Yeah, that for sure. For sure. Well, I think one of the interesting things about YA is that, you know, there is sort of like this target kind of teenage audience. And yet I think because it's probably viewed as kind of safe or PG-13, right? You end up with some really precocious or like just introverted, voracious readers who are like 11 picking things up. And then, you know, there's an adult audience for YA. And I think that's a little bit of a unique, not that other genres don't have kind of that kind of age spread or developmental kind of spread in terms of their audience. But I think it's not so much the target. I feel like YA is a tricky, there's so much that happens between the ages of like 10 and 25. Like, how do you navigate who is your target audience, right? Like, is there a specific age or age group that you're writing for? Are you trying to kind of make it universal? Do you rein in swear words or not swear words based on kind of the age of your characters? Those kinds of things. That was a very convoluted question, and I apologize for that. But really, just your thoughts on sort of like how much variance there is in the sort of age and developmental level of your audience. Lauren, Emily, I'm going to come to you first, since you brought up fuck.
Since I brought up the F word.
other fun swear words that clearly no teenagers ever heard or used.
I mean, I grew up around truck drivers, so anytime someone's like, "Oh no, children swearing," it's like, "Oh, honey," which probably is reflected in all of my YA. So as someone who writes about adult characters having sex and, you know, teenage characters getting physical, there is definitely a difference in how I write about that, because if there wasn't a difference, that would be very, very wrong. So a lot of things are more alluded to. Even those, like, they allude to a lot, because sometimes that, for me, it's whatever serves the story. And I think, I can't remember who brought this up, but not talking down to teenagers is really important to me. I will say I do sort of write with older teens in mind, just because there is kind of a lot of very adult subject matter that these young characters are having to deal with, whether that's, you know, bullying or sexual assault, or just, you know, kind of the darker parts of self-discovery. But, you know, I can't control who reads what I write. So I'm very aware there may be a very precocious 11-year-old reading Take Her Down. So yeah, it's kind of a balance, but I always think of the story first. I want to serve that best. And I'm an actor, I'm a trained theater person. And I always just try to put myself in the minds of the character and kind of like what vocabulary they'd have for whatever is going on in their lives. I don't know if I get it right or not, but I do my best.
I think that's a fantastic answer. Jeffrey.
Oh, I just completely blanked.
I can come back to you. I can repeat the short version of my really long question.
Yeah, give me the short version again.
The short version is like, do you have like a target age group, and how do you really account for the range of ages that sort of YA is targeted?
Thank you. Yeah, there were two things that were crossing my mind. One was that I was thinking about the age, the general age of the characters in my YA, and also thinking of why maybe I don't write 13 and 14-year-olds, which because that was like not my favorite part of my own life, and so I think the thing that I remember about that time is just that, you know, I had friends who were dealing with all of this big stuff. You know, it's like, you know, teenage pregnancy and like all of that, you know, family trouble and like relatives dying, and you know, they can handle a lot. They are asked to handle a lot, and so I don't feel like I pull my punches or anything like that. And I just try and tread carefully. But I also grew up in a military family, so we, you know, the F-bomb was, you know, it's like every other word. And my friends, cursed and smoked and drank, and that was reality, and that's I'm not going to necessarily shy away from that. It depends on what's appropriate for the story.
Yeah, I think that sort of comes down to it. I think we take for granted how much we sort of pretend sometimes that teenagers are still kids in ways that they're not. I mean, they are in some ways, but so much of what they're going through is not at all that.
Yeah.
J. Marshall, your sort of target audience and how you think about kind of age and maturity and such.
Well, one thing I realize is that I make my main character sort of the center of the target. So in Dubious Gift of Dragon Blood, Crispin is 17, and in my upcoming book, Barnabas Bopright Saves the City, he's 15, the main character, Barnabas. And I realize, that's one of the things about the teen years, the difference between 13 and 15 and 17 and 19. They're huge differences in terms of where you're at physically and mentally and emotionally and with experience. And so I noticed that in Dubious Gift, I'm dealing with sexuality in a very much, okay, this is happening right now, and I'm going to put it on the page and talk about it. And actually, there's one place where he finally has sex with the person who's going to become his boyfriend, and it's very beautiful and romantic. And he says, and then we did it. And he says, okay, stop. I'd be a hypocrite if I didn't talk about it. And it was finding that balance between, I'm not sitting here showing sex of 17-year-olds on a page, but I'm going to have them talk about what they experienced and what was scary to them in actual terms. And then with the new book, with Barnabas Bopright Saves the City, show the cover again. Barnabas is just really accepting the fact that he's bisexual, and the discussion around sexuality for him is giving himself permission to sit there and look at, okay, I'm in a group of, I'm in this crowd, which of these young people am I actually attracted to and why, and letting himself feel these attractions he hasn't admitted to himself before. And I think that's, that's right for where this 15-year-old is in terms of his discovery. So I guess that's my answer. I let the main character sort of set the central age of the book.
I think it's a sweet spot. It allows you, you veer just a little, you can veer to the outsides.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Where they are. Lauren, Melissa.
Oh, I was the precocious 11-year-old reading all the stuff I shouldn't have read. And so I write to her, and I write to teens that are older, and just writing about older teens. I think that the day I stepped out of like my elementary school library was the day I just only read about like 16 and 17-year-olds for the rest of my life. And now I'm still reading about 16 and 17-year-olds. And so I do recognize that some of my themes, especially in Boy at the Window, I think there were quite a few trigger warnings on Boy at the Window for good reason. They are heavy, but when I was 11, when I was 12, I was dealing with those things that Daniel is dealing with at age 16 and that G1 is dealing with at age 17. And if I wasn't, then those around me were. And so I tend to just write about those topics that, one, mattered to me, but also mattered to my friends and mattered to my siblings. And I believe that wherever a teen falls from 11 to 25, a young adult falls, that will resonate with them in some way. And if they have questions, good, they can ask them. Go to your librarian.
Yeah. I think that's fantastic. And I think there's one of the things about being that age is nobody wishes themselves a year or two younger, right? You always want to be older and more grown up than you are. So that you can sort of assume that the younger ones will want to read about the slightly older age set. Nathan, I feel like now I didn't ask you my last question. Did I miss you in that round?
You did, but the nice thing is everyone here has basically said what I would have said. So I'm going to combine the answers a little bit.
I'd like to fold that in because I would love to hear your kind of thoughts on both.
So the one thing I when it comes to thinking about my audience and the age and who they are, one thing I gave, I've been writing now for, oh God, am I at 20 years? Oh, anyway. And the one thing that was a hard lesson at the beginning to learn was that there's no such thing as an every queer or an every teen, or like, I can't write this generic character that's going to be relatable to everybody. So instead, I try to write this one specific point of view character, or all the point of view characters, to be as specifically themselves as I can. And like Laura and Melissa was saying, that all comes from like I remember going through this, or I remember my cousin going through this, or I remember like my friends, this is what it was like, and it was painful, and it was, and you know, it was what Jeffrey was saying, all the emotions are so big. It was like, it was the worst thing in the world. And 10 years later, I was like, that was not the worst thing in the world, but that didn't stop the impact being, it was the worst thing in the world. So I try to find that voice. And then I figure the audience, the readers, if they connect with the character, great. If they don't connect with the character, they're going to put the book down anyway and grab another book, and that's okay. Like, I can't make a book that's going to be good for everyone. I just can't. But I can represent the world as well as I can, as diverse as I can, as realistic as I can, and hope that I snare as many people along on the journey. But again, I don't think I've ever tried to write for everyone. I think that's a trap that will paralyze you, especially in YA. But the flip side to that as well, though, is that I am supremely conscious of how queerness isn't inherited as a culture for the vast majority of us. Like, we don't grow up with queer parents telling us about our queer grandparents. It's a very different kind of culture and history for the vast majority of us. That's actually changing a little bit these days, which is freaking awesome. I have so many queer friends who have kids, and those friends are like, those friends' kids are actually coming out, and it's like, oh my God, I can't imagine what that would be like. But for most of us, we didn't have that. I'm of the generation where the generation before mine died. For the most part, there was this giant vacuum, and the people I did know, they were dying, and it was a very complicated and difficult relationship to have with what came before. So a lot of my YA writing tends to include a huge slice of, there were people like you before. In fact, in Hope Echoes, the main plot that I put Fielding through is he's discovered a long lost lesbian love letter, and he's decided to deliver it, even though it's like 3 generations old, and he has no idea what's going to happen. And he pins a lot of hope on that moment, because he really, where he's at in his life, he's kind of really excited to have bumped into something queer that came from before. So that's the 2 things I'm conscious of. And one thing I do really sort of, I'm going to say demand, if that's too strong a word, is my covers don't scream, this is a queer book, because I remember being a queer reader, a teen, and not being able to have something visibly queer in front of my family. So like, even Exit Plans for Teenage Freaks, yes, if you read the back, it tells you right off the bat that he's a gay teen, but if I was holding that in front of a parent, they wouldn't know. Right. And so that's a big piece of it for me as well, like, leading into that whole, it's not an inherently inherited culture.
Yeah, I think that's huge, and creating like safe space for teenagers who figured out, but maybe are even still kind of questioning. And, you know, reading is one of the ways we sort of find ourselves when it's not something that surrounds us in the world. So I'm curious, Nathan, you actually talked a little bit about, you know, kind of your approach as sort of a writer, and that sort of makes me wonder. I always feel like when we have these events, we always get some kind of readers and fans, but I think so often readers are also writers, or people who are kind of thinking about writing. And so I was hoping I might ask if you were to give a piece of advice to someone who either hasn't written before and is just sort of in love with YA and kind of wants to maybe try their hand at writing, or maybe someone who's written in a different genre. I feel like most of you have written in multiple genres in your careers. What's a good piece of advice? Where might people start? Lauren, Emily, I'm going to start with you this time.
Do you want writing advice, or sorry?
Yeah. So like, if someone is sort of considering dabbling in writing YA.
Got it.
What would be a little nugget of wisdom you might impart?
Read. Just read. Read a lot of YA. I actually started writing YA because that is what I was primarily reading at the time. And I think Lauren Melissa said this too, like I still read a ton of YA. Just not even necessarily like to see, not even with a view of, oh, what's on the market, what's hot, blah, blah, blah. Just to see like what speaks to you, what's the truth you want to reflect. In my case, and this was the case of my adult writing as well. I write a lot of bisexual characters. Take Her Down has a bi protagonist. Two Winters has two. I have a lot of adult bi characters as well. And I remember the YA, even the ones I really loved, there just wasn't a lot of bi representation. And thankfully that is changing. It's changing very slowly, but it's changing. So I was really happy when Jay Marshall was like, I have a bi protagonist. I'm like, yay. But just see what speaks to you, see what's missing for you. Write the story you'd like to have as an adult reader, but also I think a lot of us have said this too, write the story that teenage you just really needed. Because for me, just as a teenager, I was a teenager in like the 90s. No bi characters anywhere, ever. If there were, that it was a joke. And just, I don't know. I write for that teenager too.
I love that. And I think that speaks to the universality of this experience, even sort of times change and trends change, that some of that core teenage longing and need remains kind of universal. Jay Marshall, do you have any nuggets of wisdom for someone thinking about writing YA? Oh, you're muted.
Probably the same as I'd say to anyone who said they want to write in general. Write what you're passionate about. Every time you're writing and a voice says to you, oh, that's not what I should write, or that won't be, people won't like that, or I won't be able to sell that, just banish that voice, because the writing is really hard and you have to spend a lot of time with it. And what fuels that is the special thing that you bring to it, the thing that you've got to shout from the rooftops. And the voices that are telling you, no, don't write that, write something else, are just sabotage, and don't listen to them. Don't think about publication, think about writing exactly the book that, oh, I've got to write this. And that's true of YA or anything.
I think it's also true in life, right?
And in life, yes.
Find what you want to do, and it probably will terrify you, and that's okay. Nathan, words of wisdom.
Ooh, that predicated on me being wise. I would say maybe that it's okay to start small. I got my start in publishing and in writing in short fiction. Now that's much harder to do in YA, but not impossible. And also to, I don't know how to say this without sounding defeatist, but understand how incredibly biased and closed door publishing can be before you begin. Like the moment you add in any marginalization, like understand that there will be some uphill climb involved here. Like I can't tell you how many times I had the door closed on something that wasn't from a queer publisher if I wrote a queer character. I had I dared to write a character who had migraines and seizures like me, and they were like, yeah, but it wasn't very inspirational. He was really upset about it. I'm like, sometimes I'm really upset about it, but publishing in general is this machine, and it is a business. And if they can have a widget that they know they will make the money on, I mean, big five, that's what they're going to do. So I think, I don't want to shoot anybody's dream in the foot. By all means, aim high. But at the same time, I think it really pays to know a little bit about the big machine that is publishing. I was a bookseller for 20 years. I lived on both sides of the counter before I started writing. I really knew what to expect. And I watch a lot of my writer friends, especially as they're starting, sort of really get discouraged when some of the realities hit, like things like returns or like how you have written the best book of your life and for some reason it hit no book lists, and that is crushing. But it just is. Sometimes there's that lucky moment that happens for someone, and often there isn't. And unfortunately, God, is our publishing industry straight and white and male and able and sorry, that was depressing, wasn't it?
No, I think a dose of reality is always good. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't write what you want to write, but know that sort of getting it into masses and maybe making lots of money doing it is a trickier.
I'm sorry, Nathan, that wasn't uplifting.
Out.
You've been voted down off the panel, not uplifting enough. Hero stars. Lauren, Melissa, any advice for folks kind of venturing into writing?
I would ask those folks who are venturing into writing YA, right? How many teens they know, like really know? How many teens do they hang out with, like really hang out with and talk to and engage in life and what they're interested in a genuine way? I think that that's really important, just because not only does it, one, it kind of gives you content, but two, it also brings the teen experience back into like what it really was like and what it really feels like. I think someone mentioned earlier, like everything is like a first, or even if it's not a first, it feels very urgent, very heavy, and very immediate. And leaning into those conversations with teens, like in saying, when they say this is so hard, you know, holding back that advice and being like validating and really getting into what is hard about it, like not making assumptions, especially because kids these days, roll credits, kids these days are experiencing things that many of us didn't experience or experience wholly, like cyberbullying, social media, a lot of different, global, like just global interaction that a lot of us didn't experience it the same way. And so we do have a lot to learn from teens as we're writing for them.
I love that advice. I think it's so important. I'm actually going to circle back to that, but Jeffrey, I want to see if you have anything to add to this mostly uplifting, thank you, Nathan, conversation.
I will keep it short. Start now. Start now. If you want to write it, start now. You know, that there will never be more time. And to that point about like following your passion, like, you know, write the parts, you know, whatever story you're working on, write the parts that are that are just, you're really eager to write. There's a writer named Matt Bell who put out a book recently of writing advice, and he talked about writing islands. Like, you don't have to write it in order. Write the parts that are exciting to you right now. And what you may find is that when you string all of those islands together, you have a story. And it's and that is what I will say about that.
That's fantastic. As someone who also writes out of order, I'm always excited to hear people validate that method. But again, like this general life wisdom, start now, right? You're every day you're not doing it is a day you're not going to be able to do it. So it's great. I have one more question that I want to kind of ask the group, which is, it's about staying current. And Laura, Melissa, you really talked about like, how many teenagers do you know and like actively spend meaningful time with? And I think there's really no substitute for that. But are there other things that you do specifically to stay kind of with what, without sort of dipping too deeply into like what's just trendy and hot right now? How do you stay kind of connected to that sort of teenage mindset? Laura, Melissa, do you have other things besides that, your personal relationships that are good go-tos for you?
Yeah, so I am on social media a lot. I am a social media influencer, one might say, in the social justice sphere around autism and neurodiversity. And a lot of teens are talking about autism and neurodiversity. And so I DM them, the ones who are supposed to be on social media, not too young. They DM me, they ask me questions, I talk back with them, I engage on Twitter, and I learn and I listen to them. And Boy at the Window is kind of for a lot of them too, because while the protagonist is Daniel is not autistic like me, he is neurodivergent and he is experiencing a lot of mental health differences and conditions that he feels like the teens around him don't understand. And it's when he connects with other teens who are neurodivergent and going through not the same, but similar experiences that he begins to kind of build a tribe and get to know himself more and finally come to a place where he can really even think about sexual identity. So yeah, I mean, it sounds weird, but social media, go to social media.
I think, for all the challenges that it's brought into our world, like the ability to find community, especially when you're maybe in a more isolated place or a really small town or surrounded by people who are not like you and don't validate those existences. It's great. Jay Marshall, thoughts to stay?
Well, I'll start by saying, yeah, the same with social media, that I'm in there and I'm watching the discourse when I'm not participating in it. And I think very importantly, just understanding what's going on economically and socially for each successive generation and what the world looks to, how they are expressing what the world looks like to them, rather than what people of my generation think the world should look like to them. And a huge inspiration for Barnabas Bopright Saves the City is kids who are saying, hi, adults, emergency, 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 climate emergency, economic emergency, education emergency, and the adult world going, yeah, no, you don't understand, or no, we can't really. And that's exactly what happens in Barnabas Bopright Saves the City. It's, hi, there's an emergency, we need you to fix this right away, and he gets ignored by successive adult after adult until he and his friends have to solve the problem. And for me, that's Greta Thunberg. That's the students of Stoneman Douglas High School. That's all the kids around the world who are doing walkouts for climate activism, and were expressing themselves with clarity and knowledge about the issues and with passion. And the book is a celebration of that, and that's what I'm listening to and what's inspiring me.
I love that. Nathan?
So I can't add a lot to what both Jay Marshall and Laura Melissa have said, but I will say one thing I have been paying specific attention to for both my YA books was how teen friendships work when everyone involved already knows each other is queer, because that was something that I had no understanding of, right? So for Exit Plans for Teenage Freaks, like I joke about it a little bit, but they actually have an LGBTQ group because they're all there. And that alphabet is important. And they're not like, so it's funny, I will often read adult fiction with queer characters, and if it's not written by queer people, there's this tendency to bump into like the gay guy, his romantic partner, and that's it. There's no one else that's queer in the whole world. And it just boggles my mind. It's like when you bump into the solo Black character or the solo disabled character, you're like, that's not how our worlds work. Like, I know like 30 other people who have seizures. I know like it's just, people who are like you. And if you don't, you try to find them, So it was really important to me to capture that dynamic of their friendships. So again, going where you're invited. I reached out to high school GSAs. I got to do some surveys and chat with them. And I had some teacher friends who brought me into their classes to talk to groups. And it was just amazing to just listen and learn. And I just asked questions and they were so freaking happy to answer. And I think that's something else that adults can sometimes lose touch with is like, you can just ask. And teenagers are really happy to tell you what's going on in their life. Like there's a speech that was basically word for word in Exit Plans where he's sitting there going, I am 17 years old. I have no freaking idea what I want to do with the rest of my life. And then there's another character who's 17 years old and absolutely knows what he's going to do with the rest of his life. And those teens exist, right? But I would bet a lot of people of my generation be like, of course they have no idea what they want to do. I'm like, well, some of them do. So again, it goes back to that. There isn't an every queer, there isn't an every teen. Yeah.
All right, we're rapidly running out of time. I want to get final words from Lauren, Emily, and Jeffrey, but if I could ask you all to throw into the chat where people can best find you, whether that's an email, a website, social media handles. I think people would love to get connected. So if you could do that. Lauren, Emily, do you have any words on staying current?
A lot of what everyone else has said, social media, reading the news, seeing what teens are doing, which are amazing things. The kids are truly all right. I also listen to what my friends say about their kids because I'm at the age where some of them are teenagers, and not in my friends complaining about their kids. My friends are saying, like, Grace is worried about this, Annalise is worried about this, and just really taking that into account, because sometimes it's the exact same stuff I worried about as a teenager, and sometimes it is not, because the world is a very different place. I will say in 2 winters, I cheated a little bit because half of it was set in 1997, which is when I was in high school, in a very conservative small town in Catholic school. So some of that was, no, this is what it was like. You could not be queer. You could not be trans. And then the second half was set in 2014, where the protagonist is not only openly bi, she has 2 mothers. She has a trans friend. She's in this very queer community. So it made for an interesting contrast. And I will say, just keeping up and just thinking about, you know, context keeps me from being lazy as a writer. In Take Her Down, one person has a problem with another person's bisexuality, and, you know, teens are more open about that now. So I really had to go into, okay, why would one teenager have a problem with another teenager being bi? So it keeps me on my toes, which is always a good thing as a writer.
We love to be on our toes. Jeffrey, I'm going to come to you for final words on staying current before we're cut off.
I guess listen and learn, and remember that, you know, it's a moving target. You know, someone who is, you know, 16 today is going to be 18 in 2 years, is going to be 20, etc. And you know, just like everyone of any age, there is no monolith. You will not necessarily have it all figured out. Just keep learning, keep being open, and keep listening.
Fantastic words to end on. I don't think we could have asked for better. Thank you, authors. Good luck, happy writing, and thank you, audience. Take care.
Thanks, gotta go feed my dog.